Next, I would like to introduce, I think this is probably one of the coolest titles I've ever heard, the Forensic Science Regulator. Andrew Renneson is the very first forensic science regulator. His principal role is to set and monitor the quality of standards for forensic science, the criminal justice system in England and Wales. He has worked very closely with forensic science experts to develop robust quality standards framework for police and laboratory forensic methods. He has a wealth of experience to share with us today, crossed an ocean to be with us. Please welcome the Forensic Science Regulator.
Well, thank you to the Academy for inviting me to speak. Alistair and I are getting quite used to sharing the stage at international events. And it's important because the issues we grapple with in the UK are exactly the same as issues you're grappling with here, in universities, in accreditation, in research, in standards. It's exactly the same they've grappled with in Australia, and I think these are hugely global issues that we should be much better at tackling on a global basis. I've now got 30 minutes to summarise 6 years' work. I've been in this very cool role as the Forensic Science Regulator for 6 years. I cease being cool at the end of next week when my job ends. Well, that was supposed to be the case anyway, but the Home Office, my employers, have been a bit slow at recruiting my replacement. So albeit I have a new job to go to as of the 3rd of March, a part-time job, I've agreed to stay on 1 day a week in the cool role of Forensic Science Regulator just to keep things going because there's a lot invested in this. And you'll see more about the role in slide number 7. But a sort of a theme coming through this morning's presentations, it just takes us back to the NAS report, the report of the National Academy of Sciences. And it was one of the very first things I read, and it was published shortly after I came into post. It is a huge read, full of hugely important stuff. And we did an assessment of the UK position against that. But since then, I've stopped reading the report. I prefer to read a couple of talks given by, and published talks by the Honourable Harry T. Edwards, who's a judge in the court, was a judge in the Court of Appeal, and co-chair of the committee that researched and produced the report. And his speeches, I think we should all read on a regular basis, because he very, very neatly summarises the issues that I've been grappling with for the last 6 years. And the bullet points he lists are a paucity of research underpinning validity. Please don't lose sight of that word, validity. A paucity of research on human observer bias. How many times has that been mentioned this morning already? Absence of research on new technology and innovation. Timothy, you raised that. It is a huge issue, and I have a huge growing issue with how quickly and easily we are being seduced into using new technology that hasn't been sufficiently validated. Rapid DNA, I think, is a classic example at the moment. I want to see far more robust validation around some of the rapid DNA techniques. Absence of rigorous mandatory certification, absence of rigorous mandatory accreditation, and so it goes on. So the report recommends all those are repaired. That was the context that I walked into, and I'll give you some further context now. My job is the Forensic Science Regulator for England and Wales. I'm a public appointee, so albeit I'm paid by the government, I'm independent of government. I'm a one-person, non-departmental public body. And it's a rather quaint English system whereby ministers can appoint me, but leave me alone to do my job. As a matter of courtesy, I keep ministers very informed as to what I'm doing. I write to them with difficult issues, and we've got one very difficult issue being discussed in my absence this week at a high-level Home Office meeting around video analytics and the validity of evidence such as facial comparison evidence. But I work very closely with other jurisdictions in Scotland and Northern Ireland, so we collaborate on standards across the whole of the United Kingdom. So we have 3 criminal justice systems. I have, across the UK, it's probably closer to 44, 45 police forces, 8 forensic science laboratories in the commercial sector, more and more police forces with internal evidence recovery and fingerprint laboratories, and we have a government forensic explosives laboratory. Scotland has their own police force and their own forensic science service, and so does Northern Ireland. So that's the cats I've had to herd, which is 43, 44 chief constables and many, many different ways of doing things. But we have one single national DNA database. I thought that presented me with a problem. When I look at the context in the United States, I think, goodness me, my life is easy. When I look at the number of laboratories, police forces, and organizations your commission will have to deal with. Prior to me coming to post, we'd been through the DNA expansion program. Our government pumped millions and millions of pounds into the better use of DNA methods, probably close to £300 million. We have what's rather fancifully called the drive for neoliberal policies, i.e. privatisation to you and I. Going back to the Margaret Thatcher era, a huge push towards privatisation of government services, a move out into the private sector. The same happened with the forensic science world. So we are now largely provided by commercial laboratories who have contracts with the police. And to answer your question earlier, we enforce accreditation through the contracts. We enforce standards through the contracts. It gives us real power to enforce standards, and we monitor that on a weekly, monthly basis. We have, of course, the commercial market. We have the European picture changing by the day. We have huge and very difficult debates in the UK around expert evidence and expert witnesses. And our Law Reform Commission has been through a phenomenal piece of work reviewing the law on the admissibility of expert evidence, because it's a mess, and the courts, in the Law Commission's view and in my view, don't have sufficient statutory powers to properly regulate expert evidence in the courtrooms. The Law Commission has made recommendations which have been shelved, sadly, because they cost money, but there are other solutions popping up. My role comes with no legislation. So it's this rather quaint process whereby ministers issue what's called a written ministerial statement, which is published in the Houses of Parliament and the House of Lords, which gives me written authority to do my work, but I have no statute or real power to my elbow. The other contextual issue, of course, is government spending. When I came into post, annual spending on forensic science across the UK was probably about £160 million a year. That is now down to about £80 million a year. So investment in forensics has halved over 5 or 6 years. Spending on forensics has halved. That has huge knock-on effects. That is a direct consequence of government budget cuts. And I think you're going to feel the same here, more and more so. And there are particular issues come with that. So that's the context. The background to the role: we had a number of major quality failings over the decades. We had a Royal Commission in 1993 that reported in consequence to a number of issues in the criminal justice system, including some of those quality failings. Since then, we've had 3 independent reviews of forensic science quality failings, led by Professor Brian Caddy. And in the Royal Commission and in those reviews, going back to the early 90s, we started hearing calls for some sort of independent forensic science regulator. The House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, in other words, our members of Parliament, in 1995 also commented, and to paraphrase them, said, it's not right in this day and age that we don't have any formal validation protocols for our forensic sciences. Back to that word validation again. We then moved to the commercial market, increasingly so through the mid-90s and the 2000s. And since I came into post, and these started before, but since I came into post, we've had a number of very important, significant case decisions in our Court of Appeal, largely led by Sir John Thomas, who's now our Lord Chief Justice, where he's made very justifiable and defensible and correct remarks, in most cases, about quality standards in forensic science. And he likes to refer things to me and says, Mr. Regulator, would you please step in and bring this science method up to the standards that we should all expect? So in the Smith case, about 3 years ago, he made a very clear recommendation in a Court of Appeal judgment that fingerprint methods should be brought up to the same standards as other forensic science laboratory methods across the UK. And also said to me, can you please find us some more defence experts? There's not enough of them. So I inherited, when I came into post in early 2008, what is described as a real good old-fashioned British adhocracy around standards. This was a lot of very well-intentioned people, all working in different directions, pulling against each other to manage the quality of the science in forensic science. The government focus on this is the bottom right-hand corner, practitioner registration, a form of certification. The government approach since 1998 had been to set up a register for practitioners, the Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners, and to practice as a forensic practitioner, you were expected to be on the register. The bill for doing that was picked up by your employer. In many other professions, you would have paid yourself. In the forensic science world, the employers picked up the bill. And this was, the expectation was some 10,500 practitioners would be registered as being competent through peer review assessment. When I came into post in 2008, they'd just reached 3,000 people. Mostly, 71% of those were staff within police forces, paid for by their police employers. So the police were investing £350,000 a year in a certification process, which I took a long, hard look at and had some meetings with the board that ran the Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners and started asking some very interesting questions. We had DNA setting the gold standard in the middle since the mid-90s, led by Dr. Bob Bramley as the custodian of the DNA database, who had been the chief scientist with the Forensic Science Service, did a fabulous job of putting DNA methods on a very solid standards footing based on accreditation against the International Laboratory Standard. So accreditation of the labs took off. The gap in that circle in the middle was the police laboratories. So the commercial, the government labs, since the mid-90s, moved towards accreditation against ISO 17025. The police in-house laboratories didn't. Medical laboratories accredited or tested against their own clinical pathology accreditation standard. I'll just park that for the minute. Fingerprints doing its own thing using the ISO 9001 standard. The gap there, because fingerprints done in-house by police, is not every police force subscribed to this. So this adhocracy was full of people who weren't talking to each other. The accreditation bodies didn't talk to the registration stroke certification body. The medical forensics world were off doing their own thing. They've done some good stuff. I don't want to be critical of them, but we're now trying to bring them more on board. Forensic pathology regulated through a register. Digital forensics, nowhere to be seen. And even now, digital forensics, the examination of cell phones, computers, digital instruments, happens in probably every major investigation that we are involved in. No standards. And we're trying hard to rectify that. And it comes back to your research point, extremely relevant. So I took a long, hard look at this, discussed it with my advisory council, and said, what do we need to do? And I'll come on to that. But my role in all of this was very, very clearly set out in the ministerial statements. And it was to establish quality standards to get us away from that adhocracy and to monitor compliance with those standards, to deal with complaints about the standards. And since I've been in post, I've now investigated, it's now 70 different cases around quality failings. And if you Google Forensic Science Regulator onto my website, you'll see we've published reports on a number of key issues, predominantly around human error. To establish standards, regardless of where that forensic science is delivered, it can be in-house by a police force or by an external laboratory, and to look at the standards for the forensic intelligence databases, such as the National DNA Database and the National Ballistics Information System. And very importantly, there's a box at the bottom, is to provide advice to ministers and the criminal justice system, increasingly so the Lord Chief Justice, on issues around forensic science. I'm supported by a Forensic Science Advisory Council. We have judges, we have prosecutors, we have the police. You can read the list there. They provide me fantastic support and advice, and we meet 3 times a year. We meet next week. I chair it. We have a very interesting discussion about the evaluation and presentation of evidence, and some interesting papers being presented there. I'm looking for advice on guidance on the direction we take on the evaluation of evidence. I'm supported by a number of specialist groups. I have the power to set these up and set the terms of reference, and they all have very clearly published terms of reference. I have a group looking at quality standards, so they advise me on the standards framework more generically. That group, for example, also meets next week. I chair it. We have a paper on contextual bias. We have spent, William Thompson, I might even be in the room, came across and did a presentation to my advisory council about 4 or 5 years ago on exactly this issue. We've been debating it for 4 or 5 years. We now want to do something about it. I was at a conference in Scotland a few years ago where a very eminent member of the audience here, Professor Reisinger, said, Andrew, we don't need more research, we need action to solve the problem. He's correct. So a paper that's coming to my group next week will talk about expectation bias, confirmation bias, anchoring effects, contextual bias, role effects, reconstruction effects, all the things that come under the sort of generic heading of contextual observer bias. And we are going to be putting some very, very clear standards and solutions in place over the next year or so. I have a specialist group looking at DNA, fingerprints, and so it goes on. The latest one is the medical world, medical forensics. Because I have very limited resources and limited time, I have a team of 4 people. That's it, that's us. A healthy budget for developing standards, so I am able to outsource work, which expedites it. I stepped back from looking at the medical world because I knew it would absorb a lot of my time and energy. I've now stepped into it, both feet first, because the whole world of medical forensics is really beginning to cause me some concerns, and I'm talking here about the medical examination of the victims of sexual offences and serious assault, and the examination of suspects as well by medical practitioners. And the medical practitioners are asking me to step in and support them in the development of proper standards. And this was triggered by a presentation at my advisory council in February last year by the prosecutors complaining at the poor quality of evidence they were receiving from medical forensic examiners. This is proving to be a very, very exciting piece of work, and I'll come back to it in a minute. We have a group looking at contamination. There is no doubt that one of the biggest sources of error in forensic science in the UK at the moment is contamination creeping into the system. A real issue is contamination coming in through the consumables that are provided into the system and the digital world, enough said. So we took a long, hard look at this and said, how do we break away from this adhocracy? What do we need in terms of standards? And there was a very good workshop, I think, picked up on one of the issues. It was workshop 12. I think it might have been yesterday, it might even be today, when blaming the analyst completely misses the point. And if I go back to that registration process, we had that certification process, I became very, very concerned, and I saw real evidence of this over the decades, that when things did go wrong, the organisation took 10 steps backwards, the finger was pointed at the practitioner, it's your fault, we're going to sort you out. We had to get away from that blame culture. It is not the individual analyst's fault when things go wrong. We need to be pointing the finger at the organisations. So the very early conclusion that I came to, is that I want to see far more evidence of what we term now as organisational competence. So does the organisation have proper quality management systems? Do the senior managers take a proper interest and management control of quality and quality standards? Because in the past, once you had a certification registration process, senior managers were able to wash their hands of it and say, no, we've delegated that to the certification body, they manage competence and standards for us. The wrong approach. We were hitting the wrong target, very clearly. But I want to see evidence of competent practitioners. And here we come, back to this issue of validation again. I want to see very clear evidence that methods are demonstrably valid and fit for purpose. We had a major trial in Northern Ireland about 10 years ago where the judge, Mr. Justice Weir, was persuaded that low template DNA methods had not been validated by the Forensic Science Service and dismissed the evidence. There's a whole debate whether he got that right or wrong, but he was persuaded on the evidence presented to him that a major leading edge method hadn't been sufficiently validated. He dismissed the evidence. House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, as I've already said, in 1995, questioned our validation protocols. It is inexcusable, in my view, and Harry T. Edwards said the same, it's inexcusable to be adopting methods that we can't validate. I'll come back to that. And then lastly, I've added an issue around impartiality. I want to see very clear evidence, and it comes back to our contextual bias issues. I want to see very clear evidence that the evidence presented by forensic science experts is impartial, it's objective, it is not skewed in any shape or form by the people that employ you, that instruct you, that ask you to do the work. And I want to see a compliance mechanism around that. That comes with accreditation. I want to see more guidance and standards, and I think, and I know, there is an increasing role here for the professional bodies, such as the the Royal Anthropological Institute, who are represented possibly in the room today, certainly at a workshop later this week, such as the Institute for Archaeologists, such as the Royal College of Pathologists, the Royal College of Physicians, all of these people working closely with me now to develop guidance and standards for their members. That's an entirely appropriate course to take. So, here's the standards framework that I leave behind me and that will roll on into the future. Based on accreditation, I won't go down the road of forensic pathology, time doesn't allow. We have the professional bodies more and more involved. I, in 2011, published codes of practice and conduct that set out the standards that are expected. They have been welcomed and accepted across the UK. We have also developed a British standard for consumables. So think back to my comment about contamination creeping into the system. I maintain now that a percentage of crime scene profiles on our national DNA database are contaminant profiles. We don't know which ones they are. We're doing a purge of that very, very shortly. We've got to deal with the issue of contamination, particularly as we move towards the new and more responsive and sensitive DNA 17 and 24 chemistries. So we've published a British standard. It's called PAS 377. A PAS is akin to a British standard. It sets out the standards we demand for consumables you buy into the system. So it's helping to resolve that problem. And we've set up a whole system of guidance and standards around elimination databases, because you will not eliminate contamination, but when it happens, you've got to be able to identify it and eliminate the source very, very quickly. Time marches on. So we now have our laboratories all accredited to ISO 17025, the international standard for testing and calibration laboratories. When I came into post, no police labs were accredited. We now have 34 of our 43 police forces accredited against this standard. That is an outstanding achievement in the space of 6 years. Within another 6 years, the police have come to me with their Vision 2020 and said, Andrew, we want to agree with you and UCAS a program of accreditation for all our forensic activities by 2020, including collision investigation, crime scene investigations, every aspect of police forensics. They are voluntarily stepping into this now, despite the cost. Because they've been through it, they now feel, know, understand the benefits, because there are huge benefits to working to these standards. But we're very careful here on this accreditation. I don't accept people saying to me, but I'm an accredited laboratory. And I think your research question goes beyond was the work accredited, it's what's the scope of accreditation. Because I am fed up with laboratories saying, but we're accredited. And when you dig in, it's a very, very narrow scope of accreditation. So your question should be, was that method accredited, not just the lab accredited? So you've got to check the detail and the fine print on some of this. We've now adopted and tested ISO 17020 as the crime scene standard. It's a sister standard, 17025. It works very well for crime scene investigations. We have our first organisation accredited against it, Cellmark Forensics. They piloted it for us, a very successful piece of work, and more people will graduate towards this. Collision investigators in the future. And here's the interesting one. We're now moving, or we have a plan that we need to test our medical forensics world towards the ISO 15189 standard. 15189, if you don't know, is ISO 17025 redrafted for the medical world. It brings in more patient care issues. And what we've worked out very early on is that you cannot untangle, and you should not untangle, the patient care pathway issues from the forensic science standards when you're examining a traumatized victim of rape, for example. The two go hand in glove. We want to provide a joined up, very clear service set with very clear standards set around that. So we will be piloting next year accreditation against 15189. They're all out of the same stable of standards. So if you are already accredited against one of those, an application to move into the other is no more than an extension of scope, is the deal that we've struck in the UK. It's not a fresh application. It's not a new quality management system. You can use the same quality management system, but you extend your scope into a new standard. That's a very exciting standards framework. People have bought into this, and we'll have that well and truly embedded, well, we have now, but more of it embedded over the next 5 or 6 years. Underpinned by my Code of Practice and Conduct and PAS 377, which is the standard for consumables, which the Australians are leading on now, converting parts of that into an international standard. And hats off to these guys. A colleague of Ali's was over in Birmingham 2 weeks ago leading the ISO committee on this, Dr. Lindsay Wilson-Wild, where they have signed a motion to turn that committee into a full technical committee, which means, for the first time ever, we're going to now start taking a proper, long overdue look at the international standards framework for forensic science. Can we do better than the current ISO standards? Can we start creating bespoke standards for forensic science? I think there's a 10, 15, 20-year journey in that, but I think we've just taken the first steps thanks to these guys, and hats off to you. It's a brave piece of work. So, start to wrap up. Codes of Practice and Conduct built on those 3 standards. There it is. It's available on my website. It was published in 2011. At my meeting of my quality group next week, we hopefully will agree the next version, which will be on the website. It's free to download. Back to validation again. It is no accident that 25% of that code of practice deals with the thorny issue of validation. We've also published a guidance document on validation, which is producing some real heat and debate, which is good. Not everybody agrees with me. They don't have to. But we'll work our way through this and support people with very clear guidance on what validation should look like. I've just commissioned a piece of work to write a guidance paper on validation for digital methods. Because digital methods need some rather unique validation exercises. People are totally lost in it. They admit it. They say, we don't quite know where to start with this. So this is where we're extending the code of practice over the next year or so. We've just published some work on fingerprints. We've done a lot of work on contamination, digital video. Troubles me, we have some solutions in place. And so it goes on. The contextual bias piece of work should be on that list. A paper is about to be published on it. Doing some great work around nuclear forensics in the event of terrorist incidents. And so it goes on. This is just the start of the next stage of the journey. The third aspect of the standards framework I've already mentioned is the work with the professional bodies. There's the list of people we are now working with. Thank you. And this is producing some very, very exciting results, and you'll see some of it presented by the anthropologists at this conference. Current issues, I still am concerned at the absence of a strategy for forensic science in the UK. I've mentioned the Vision 2020 being promoted by the police, which I fully support. We're investigating the idea of quality pathways, which I haven't got time to go into now, but it's a new concept about reaching the end goal of accreditation. So accreditation is a bit of a binary process at the moment. You're either accredited or you're not, or we think there's some halfway staging posts that will help us along the road. So you might be able to issue a statement that says, well, your methods are valid, but you haven't quite reached the final stages yet. It'll help people along the way. And I still deal with complaints, increasing concerns about human error creeping into the system. Yes, huge issues around research and development. We're doing some very good work on that with our Technology Strategy Board. European Global Standards I've mentioned, and some work led by the Australians, and I am the head of delegation for the UK on the European Standards Committees. And finally, our ministers have listened to my recommendations that this role should now be on a statutory footing. They've published a consultation paper. They're working through the 56 responses they received. I predict by mid-2015, my role finally will be on a statutory footing, which will help my successor, who should be recruited July, August this time, in their future work. Thank you very much indeed.